All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the evening session, AEDC 2020. If you are not following the hashtag AEC 2020 and hashtag AEC 2020 virtual, please do so. And do join us on our virtual platforms like we earlier mentioned. We are virtual now. But ladies and gentlemen, just to bring you up to speed, you need to follow us on our social media platforms: Twitter, AEC Congress 2020, Instagram at AEC Congress, on Facebook, African Economic Congress, and on YouTube, African Economic Congress. And on streaming live right now, we're streaming on Money Live with Nancy TV, and also on AIT Official, AIT_online, and also at official AIT Live. Ladies and gentlemen, just in case you're joining, welcome back. It has been a wonderful session in the morning. In case you missed out, just tell your friend, don't worry. All you need to do is sit back, relax, and catch up with what we've done so far. In the morning, we had splendid personalities to discuss with us as regards forging ahead with the African economy. We had Her Excellency Joyce Banda join us, and also had the ambassador of the Arab Republic of Egypt to Nigeria, likewise also having the High Commissioner of the United Republic of Tanzania to Nigeria, and also we had the High Commissioner of the Republic of Namibia to Nigeria talk to us as regards the way forward to march Nigeria forward. Not just Nigeria, Africa as a whole. Let me start off with this proverb, a popular Somalian proverb: poverty is slavery. And to break poverty, break away from poverty to be precise, you need to think, align yourself with people, and forge ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Moses Nwuneli, and with me is Mark Ogbonnaya doing the deed. It's not easy, actually. But ladies and gentlemen, we will not waste your time. We'll proceed straight off into the evening session. And for the evening session, we have a session on agriculture, where we'll be delving into every little aspect that ticks the economy of Africa. But to do that, ladies and gentlemen, I would want to welcome our speakers. I will start off with recognizing Professor Afeikhena, Jerome, the Special Advisor to the Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture, African Union Commission. He also is the Professor of Economics in Nigeria and member of the Strategic Studies Group of the African Capacity Building Foundation, Zimbabwe. He doesn't stop there. He moves on to also becoming the Visiting Scholar, International Monetary Fund, IMF, and also he is the Visiting Fellow, World Bank. He holds several offices, but I cannot exhaust it. But ladies and gentlemen, he's not just joining us online. We also have online with us Ndidi Okonkwo Nwuneli, the co-founder Sahel Consulting, who is the co-founder AACE Foods and also the chair of Nourishing Africa. She is also the founder Leap Africa, and she also holds several offices. But due to time constraint, we would not be able to do that. But ladies and gentlemen, also to recognize one more of our speakers, Martin Fregene, the Director, Agriculture and Agro-Industry, African Development Bank, AFDB, Abidjan. He is also the plant geneticist and agricultural policy expert with over 25 years of research and development experience at 2 international agricultural research centers. He also is the former director of the Bio Cassava Plus project at the Danforth Center. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about people who know what it is to tick the economy of agriculture in Africa. But ladies and gentlemen, to moderate this session, I won't be the one. I would want to introduce our moderator, the Senior Manager, Tax and Regulatory Services, Deloitte. In person, Tosin Adedoyin. Ladies and gentlemen, do join them online. Tosin, over to you.
For the introductions, and a big welcome to everyone to the first panel session of the African Economic Congress. In this session, we're going to be looking at the topic transforming and safeguarding Africa's food systems post-COVID-19. You'll all agree that the COVID pandemic has brought about consequences, both direct and indirect, for countries globally. And while Africa may have escaped relatively unscathed in terms of number of fatalities, the effect of the pandemic on the economy and the food security of many African nations cannot be overemphasized. About 670 million people in Africa, roughly half of the population, already face food insecurity. It therefore becomes very necessary to tackle the effects of the pandemic. Agriculture is also one of Africa's most important economic sectors, making up to 23% of the continent's GDP. Also in sub-Saharan Africa, it provides work for nearly 60% of the economically active population. The current system is placed in place has faced immense pressure in the last few months, and this has caused significant disruptions to the consumers, governments, businesses, and farmers. However, this is not the time to rely on yesterday's strategies and methods of doing agriculture. Existing vulnerabilities in Africa's agriculture and food systems combined with demand and supply shocks likely to flow from COVID-19 could be heightened unless mitigating factors, mitigating actions, steps are taken now. So to kick off the conversation, I'm going to be starting with Professor Jerome. Professor Jerome, the World Food Program Executive Director, David Beasley, stated in April 2020 that there are currently 821 food insecure people in the world, and an additional 130 million people may be added to this number due to the effect of COVID-19. The largest impact being in Africa. In your opinion, what are the broad reasons for food insecurity around the world, and particularly in Africa? Professor Jerome, over to you.
Thank you, moderator. Let's start from the very beginning so that we'll know how we'll move forward. Africa is basically agrarian, like you said in your remarks. We're beginning to see some form of social transformation because currently agriculture is responsible for 16% of the gross domestic product of sub-Saharan Africa. That is from World Development Indicators. But what happens there is that they do not merge the statistics of sub-Saharan Africa together with that of North Africa. And if you look at the breakdown, it ranges between 2% in Botswana, also 2% around South Africa, to about 59% in Sierra Leone, which is by far the highest in the world. Agriculture, as you already mentioned, produces about 65% of the continent's labor force, as well as 75% of the domestic trade. We hope we'll have time to reflect on this as we're moving towards trading in the Continental Free Trade Agreement, because these are the levers we need to build upon. Now, coming statistically to what you were saying about the prediction about Africa, find that invariably, if you look at African agriculture and the food systems, they've been witnessing consecutive shocks in the past 3 or 4 years. In addition to climate change and conflict, which is making the level of food security so high in Africa. There are several dimensions. FAO, they have many of these statistics or something, but the joint report, which we did together with the FAO for the African Union, we recorded 256 million Africans, or 20% of the population, suffering from chronic undernutrition in 2018. 239 million of them were in sub-Saharan Africa. And that was even before COVID hit. At the same time, about 12% of the population were categorized as obese or overweight because of imbalanced diets. We are seeing what is happening with COVID, that the first target are those who are not eating healthy diets. Invariably, looking at the statistics, you find that this is the first time for the past 25 years, the continent, Africa, is going to face a big recession in 25 years. That is what the statistics from our brother ADB is telling us. Because the economy is going to contract anything from between minus 2.1% to minus 5.1% in 2020. And specifically for the agri sector, we're going to have a growth rate of minus 7%. The situation is quite poor. And just quickly to give you a statistics too, before we move to the discussion of what the COVID did or not did. At the African Union, we have a biannual review report where we monitor where progress countries are making towards the Maputo and Cadep declarations. The last report was issued in 2020. Unfortunately, only 4 countries are on track in that report towards meeting the Malabo declarations by 2025, which is not good enough. But the good thing is that looking at the statistics very well, as many as 36 countries, we are able to see some form of improvement relative to the first biannual review report. I guess I will stop here so fast before we bring in some other dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So what I gather from what you said is climate change, and also you also draw some statistics regarding where we are. So coming to you, Dr. Martin Fregene, Professor has already highlighted what the broad reasons are for the current food insecurity position in the world, right? I would also want you to also state what has been Africa's engagements regarding and commitments regarding ending food security and the nutrition deficits in Africa. And do you also consider these efforts, right? Are they sufficient so far? Do we also need to do more? I mean, what has Africa been doing regarding curbing food insecurity in Africa? What has African governments been doing regarding this? Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Tosin. As a matter of fact, if you look at agricultural production all around the world and value addition, you can almost find a common playbook when it comes to transforming the agricultural sector. It has to do with productivity through the introduction of new technologies. That's new seeds and new methods of soil amendments, new methods of production. It has to do with policies that create incentives for the private sector to invest. It has to do with with R&D, research and development, to even develop even newer technologies. It has to do with organized markets. So the playbook is the same. And if you look at Africa, as a matter of fact, many countries in Africa are trying to apply those same, and then with some success. Let's be honest. 2% increase per year of agricultural productivity in Africa in the last 10 years or so is fairly high when you compare it with the rest of the world. The problem is that 2% increase per year of agricultural and production and value addition falls short of the average population growth on the continent between 2 and 3%, and also falls short of the increased demand from the growth of per capita, and GDP, and per capita income. Once income grows, people want to eat more meat, poultry. People want to eat more vegetables, and then so you have, even though Africa is growing, in the agricultural sector, but the demand and also population growth is making us fall short, and that has led to a $47 billion food imports that is poised to increase. So countries have been responding. I can tell you about countries like Sudan has really responded very strongly on wheat, working with the African Development Bank to raise productivity of wheat, by introducing heat-tolerant wheat varieties. I can tell you about also in Kenya, working with drought-tolerant maize, climate-adapted maize varieties, to increase production. They're every country is trying, but there are still some serious gaps, and I would like to address those gaps. I'll mention them, just 3 of them. The first one is the productivity gap. The second one is what I call the policy gap. And the third one is what I call the know-how gap. On the productivity gap, you see, for you to take new varieties and make sure that they reach all your farmers and increase their productivity, for you to be able to ensure that farmers have access to fertilizer that is required for new varieties to reach their capacity, you need to have a strong extension system that is able to deliver those varieties to the farmers and also teach them how to use properly. Many African countries, over the years, because of demand by international finance institutions to de-emphasize, public-oriented, support to agriculture, we have had extension system just go very weak. Secondly, we have also had a huge problem with seed companies not being able to receive these technologies and deliver it to farmers. Here, the continent needs help. On the policy gaps, it might interest you to know that 80% of all the food on the African continent is supplied by SMEs, small and medium enterprises. But these enterprises, they suffer from a lot of very high transaction costs from very poor infrastructure, rural infrastructure, from poor warehouse wholesale market infrastructure, where they can take their goods to and sell. They also suffer from trade policies that are not aligned to agricultural policies. So we do have a policy gap that countries need to address. And of course, the know-how gap. Agriculture is become very, very scientific. You need knowledge. What are the source of the crops to be able to, achieve productivity? And we don't have the kind of vocational training that is found in South America, or we don't have the kind of degree training that is actually oriented to practical agriculture that you have in the US, like the University of Florida. So we do need to also that policy know-how. You will see that you will make faster progress. What the bank is trying to do, just to wrap up, what the bank is trying to do is actually to help countries to increase productivity through its Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation Program, or TAS. On the policy also, we're working very closely with platforms of SMEs to be able to articulate and then go to government and ask them to change those policies to what we call policy-based operations. And finally, on the know-how, we are trying to bring this virtual training on agriculture that is very well known in Latin America, very well known in Asia, into Africa, that our young people can acquire know-how to improve agriculture on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. You have mentioned some key points that I am also very interested in, and that is regarding technology. You mentioned that there are three policy gaps, policy gap, productivity gap, and know-how gap. But I just want to focus on the know-how, which has to do with technology. Technology has already made a marked impact on agricultural productivity, from artificial intelligence to use of smart machines, and yielding, production of high yield crops using technology, and even up to crowdfunding. I mean, technology has been used in several ways to foster agricultural development in Africa. But what we've seen is that this is yet to manifest all over Africa, because you still have some people that are still using the crude method. So in your, Dr. Martins, how do we ensure optimization of technology across Africa to transform Africa's food system? What do you think we can do to make sure that the know-how goes all over the countries in Africa?
Okay, so there is the component that is what I would call public sector, driven. And that's very important. And there's the component that's also private sector driven. And there's a component that is what I call civil society driven. On the component that is public sector driven, for example, you mentioned ICT and the use of ICT to, to reduce transaction costs. Well, ICT requires infrastructure, telecom infrastructure, including in the rural areas, right? That is a very, very important point. And then also, with respect to technologies, you also, need the public sector to step in with seed systems, laws that, for example, in DRC, there is no law that prevents somebody from selling, grain as seed. So those are all things that the public sector has to do to ensure that technology becomes widely available. You must have regulation, you must have infrastructure, and you must also have a very strong, oversight. From the private sector point of view, the private sector requires finance and also requires access to training. Again, finance that is affordable, that is short, that is long-term, and also low interest rates is very important for the private sector to acquire. That is why development banks like us are taking a lot of pain to ensure that we share risk with commercial banks, what we call the risk-sharing facilities, to enable commercial banks lend to the private sector. And then know-how, like I mentioned very briefly before, know-how is something that is the base of all progress. You must be able to get the private sector the know-how they need. And we have looked at many options. One option is what we call the platform approach. The platform is a group of private sector people that have a website or something where we can easily post, material that people can, just learn. If it's how to milk a cow or how to drive a tractor, that they can initially begin to acquire knowledge, and then later on they can always go and go and practice all that knowledge. Lastly, as I mentioned, apart from the public and the private, there's also civil society. You mentioned the crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is such an important, very, very important, part of financing agriculture now. But it's also philanthropy. Philanthropy is also very, very important to be able to acquire the knowledge, to be able to pay for those things. That is where civil society comes in. Civil society needs to also be at the table, to ensure that all that is required, by the private sector, all that's required by the government to do, there's advocacy, there is financing, there is support to get those things done. Just we'll use one example: seeds. Seeds are so important, but many of these seeds, many companies don't go into them because farmers can reuse their old seeds, so they don't go into them. This is where government has to come in, and this is where civil society has to advocate for farmer organizations to ensure that government provides the regulatory background, and also to ensure that government provides the quarantine, that this can enter the country without any problems, and then they can easily be used to raise productivity. It can be used to farmers to raise productivity. So those three groups, the public, the private, and the CSO, civil society organizations, are very key in achieving scaling up of technologies on the African continent.
Thanks so much, Doctor. That's very insightful. So let me come back to you, Professor. You are the special advisor to the AU, African Union, on and the Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture in the AU, right? So many global experts have predicted that this pandemic is going to be like between a 12 to 18 month battle. And we should expect future pandemics and future shocks that would then be linked to climate change and other crises. Professor, in your view, what practical steps can African governments consider to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on agriculture and also bolster Africa's food security? Over to you, Professor. Professor, I think your mic is on.
Sorry, yeah. Invariably, the African Union has been coordinating most of the efforts in terms of response to the pandemic. And just as Anna said, I mean, the earlier we live with the pandemic, the better for everybody, because I think it's going to be with us for a long time. What happened was that I briefed you earlier on that Africa, this sector has been one of shock, beginning with the fall armyworm in 2018, the desert locusts in 2019, currently the Horn of Africa, and it's been the worst in the past 70 years. Currently, now we have COVID. We've not even finished with COVID. We're having flash floods affecting several countries. So the sector has been very, very unlucky. So what we are trying to do is to make sure that we do not have a hunger pandemic as a result of the loss of lives and their livelihoods because of COVID. So what the African Union did was that they met together with FAO. They had a meeting of African agricultural ministers. The first of this meeting was on 16th April 2020. And as many as all 55 African countries attended this meeting, 45 of them at ministerial level, including Nigeria. Specifically, they targeted 5 issues on how to mitigate COVID. My brother Martin will support me. We are both members of the task force. The first one is social protection. We know social protection is gradually catching up in Africa, but it's not there yet the way you want it. Especially the vulnerable. These are the people targeted by this pandemic. We need to find ways of making sure they have access to social protection. The second one was crop calendars and recommended actions during COVID-19 outbreak in Africa region. Because different African countries, they have different planting season and others. So to make sure, because at some point, because of the lockdowns, you couldn't import. Fregene told us that we import as much as 47 billion, which you can ill afford. We waste that money importing food. Even then was not possible during COVID. So we now strategically had to be looking for how to support countries to make sure that they're able to produce what they need. The third issue was they needed to support domestic markets during COVID-19 outbreak in Nigeria. I'm sure very many of the policies which you saw the Nigerian minister implement, whereby food was allowed to move all over the country. I mean, it's directly taken from this ministerial meeting. The fourth one was that we want to start taking the advantage of the newly created African Continental Free Trade Area. Hopefully, trading is going to start on 1st of January, 2020. And it's an opportunity for us to reduce the food import bills, an amount which you can at least afford. The final issue, what they did was how to safeguard input supply chains, both for small-scale producers, farmers, fisheries, and livestock in the context of COVID-19 in Africa and beyond. So what these ministers did, they came out with a ministerial declaration targeting what they want to do. So what we've done after that is that a task force comprising of all the major players in African agricultural sector has been constituted. I mean, you have ADB as a member of the task force, AU, of course, as a member of the task force, the European Union is there, and they formed themselves into 4 main work streams. We're helping countries to implement very many of these COVID forces. In fact, a meeting is being planned for November, whereby the task force members, I think about 7 or 8 of them, they want to report back to ministers to say, this is what we have been able to do in terms of helping countries to mitigate the impact of COVID. I mean, when you say that this task force is who? I mean, World Bank, ADB, or what have you, whoever matters in Africa. The second thing, before I leave that point alone, was that looking at very many of these declarations, you find that it's not what only the agricultural sector alone can impact on, which was why this task force decided that there was a need for a tripartite meeting of the ministers of finance, the ministers of trade, and the ministers of agric. So this particular meeting held on 27th July 2020. this meeting also came out with some recommendations that sort of supported the earlier one, which agri ministers came out with. It was quite timely because part of the challenges we're having is that if you look at the Malabo Maputo declarations, I mean, looking at our annual review report, no country spent up to 10% of the annual budget on agriculture for this particular year. Yet we are having COVID. So it's been very, very challenging and tough. So part of the initiatives we are looking for now is that where we can get separate funding, because you actually need funding for this sector. Considering the fact that 12 million youths, they enter the job market every year. This is the only sector that will be able to give them sustainable jobs. So we need to prepare or have to build back better and stronger. So let me stop here for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. You are right. I mean, you're spot on that. I mean, this agri sector is the largest employer of youths in the continent. So coming to you, Ndidi. So Professor has mentioned what African governments would do, and from what he has said, he has also mentioned that the private sector is also an active participant in bolstering Africa's food security. So I would like you to state from the private sector perspective, companies in the value chain, what are they supposed to do? What do they need to do to help us curb this food insecurity in Africa? Over to you, Ndidi.
The perspective that private sector actually has to be the driver of growth in the sector. That's actually one of the reasons we've gotten it wrong. We've taken agriculture as almost like a CSR intervention, a social good, instead of viewing it as an engine of growth driven by the private sector. The governments in Africa should not be playing in the sector. They should be settling the policies and creating an enabling environment and de-risking the sector. And in most of our countries, they've gotten involved as active players in the sector, distributing fertilizer, actually buying tractors, actually even setting up farms, which has been the wrong approach. So I believe the private sector should be driver. And in some countries where we've seen the private sector drive the sector, we've seen tremendous results. We see that in Morocco, for example, the private sector is in the driver's seat. In countries such as Egypt, we also see that. In many West African countries, we've actually gotten it wrong. Now, I'm involved in a number of initiatives, and I'd like to give some very specific examples. We've launched nourishingafrica.com. It's a portal envisaged as a home for 1 million agripreneurs that will create this $1 trillion industry for the sector. And building on what Dr. Fregene said, it's really about leapfrogging, leveraging innovation and technology. And through this portal and through this hub, we've actually attracted 600 agri-businesses that are driving the growth in the sector from farm to fork. Similarly, through my work with Sahel Consulting, what we're seeing is an appetite for private sector to invest, to backward integrate, to source locally. And through one of our programs, which is called Advancing Local Dairy Development in Nigeria, we're actually doing that. We're actually linking smallholder dairy farmers to milk processors who historically were importing powdered milk from the Netherlands or from Denmark and from New Zealand. And now they're sourcing locally in Nigeria and producing for the local market. And that's what we appreciate, is when companies say, you know what, I can actually source locally. Africa is naturally endowed for agricultural excellence. There's no reason why we should be net importers of food. There's no reason why we should have food insecurity. So what are some 4 critical things we need? First, we need an enabling environment. Private sector cannot thrive where there's flip-flopping of policies, where there are restrictions on importation of capital equipment, agricultural equipment, where there are restrictions on even transportation. Private sector needs rural infrastructure, feeder roads, affordable energy. And this is where the government should spend its time creating that enabling environment. The second thing that private sector needs is talent for the sector. I've been preaching this for a long time. We need to rethink how we teach agriculture. Every single company I'm involved in is struggling with talent because we're still training people for agriculture as a science, not agriculture as a business. We need to revamp our vocational training institutions, piloting and prioritizing agriculture, food processing food production throughout the industry so that we can have talents to drive the growth of this sector. Third, we need catalytic financing. And we've seen a few efforts at this, and I know the AFDB is doing a lot in the area of catalytic financing, but we need more affordable, more patient capital for private sector, and we need de-risking of capital. And then finally, we need collaboration. I think in Africa, what we've been constrained by is still seeing ourselves as national players or even local players in the sector, instead of taking advantage of cross-border trade, taking advantage of our entire region as a basket, as a market. And if this is a $1 trillion industry, there is potential for every single player. I have seen profitable businesses in this sector that have thrived because of innovation. And we need to move from primary production to processing. We need to promote proudly African food, celebrate proudly African food, and actually create a policy environment, back to policy, where we enforce local sourcing. In Brazil, they did something. They insisted on 30% local sourcing. I would say we should be bold enough to push for 50% local sourcing, not just for multinationals, but for restaurants, for hospitals, for school feeding programs, where we are creating incentives for local sourcing. I think there's so many opportunities around urban agriculture that we're not even touching. So for me, I think this is a wide space, and I'm so excited about the growth that we're seeing in this sector. But I think the biggest shift is a paradigm shift, that this is agribusiness and that money can be made in this sector, and private sector has to be the driver of growth, leveraging innovation and technology.
Thanks, Ndidi. One very important fact that you mentioned, which I would also like Professor and maybe Dr. Martins to respond to, is the fact that you're saying that the private sector is the major driver of growth in agric, right? So you mentioned that the government should leave it to the private sector. What they should do is just create an enabling environment for the private sector. But I would like to hear from Professor whether this is the way to go, to leave it to the private sector to drive the growth in agriculture. Can we curb food insecurity by leaving it totally to the private sector to drive, or do we still need the government to also be involved in agriculture? Professor and Dr. Martins, can you respond to that?
Martins, I know your boss like using the term that agriculture is a business, and that is what everybody has come to embrace the sector, how we want it to look at. Invariably, yes. Martin mentioned that majority of the farmers we have in Africa are small-scale family farmers who cultivate just maybe 2 acres or 4 acres of land at maximum. These are not the real people who will actually bring change to this particular sector. We want the big businesses to be part of this. I mean, take our country, for example. I mean, what is the average age of the farmers? I mean, many of them are close to 70 years, disappearing. I don't know. It's an endangered species, except to find a way to get the youth to become more interested. I mean, when I was with FAO before, part of my job was trying to get youth interested in pure agriculture. Many of them were not interested, but they are interested in value services around agriculture, which is where, as we move ahead, digitalization is very, very important, very, very crucial. It's changing the perception of agriculture, making it more profitable, and we need to be able, I mean, to assist the youth in reforming this particular sector, bringing more of them, like Ndidi already mentioned. I mean, the big farmers, big agripreneurs, we actually need them to seize the developments in this particular field. Let me stop here for now.
Yeah, Tosin, I think I subscribe to what Ndidi said, that the private sector is the primary driver of agricultural transformation. because let's look at the investments required for agricultural transformation on the continent. It's been estimated, the African Development Bank did a study. We estimated that it would take between 24 billion and $30 billion every year to get the value chains being efficient, and then get all what is required to transform agriculture in Africa for us to become food secure. Of that, if you look at all what governments are putting across the continent, look at what the multilateral development banks are putting, it only comes to about 7 to 8 billion. The remainder between 17 to 23 billion has to come from the private sector, and they're already investing. Many of them are already, these SMEs, many of them don't even take loans. They use their own money to aggregate, their own money to add value, their own money for third-party logistics to transport from the farm, to the cities, their own money, to markets. They're already doing that. But government still has a role to play, a very important role. And that role is to reduce the transaction costs for the private sector, build the rural roads, have strong regulatory. I mentioned seed. It's a very serious thing. If you sell farmers bad seed, that farmer would never know until they harvest. So the government has to have strong, strict laws that says if you sell grain as seed, you go to jail, and enforce those laws. Government also has to have what they call laboratories to ensure that certified seeds actually meet the qualifications of at least 80% germination. Again, that's government's role. The president cannot do that. You mentioned ICT, and I mentioned, the telecom infrastructure in the rural areas. That's government's role. But perhaps more importantly, government has to fund research and development. You see, all what we see today in any country, let's just take computers. Computers are, if an average computer has like 2 billion transistors. Transistors were developed by the Bell laboratories, way back in the 60s and 70s. Just that created all those, those things that eventually, today, we see the huge impacts. So it's government that has to, that has to finance research and development. Let me just use the example of Brazil again. Brazil, transformed this sterile cerrados, that's the savannas, from a $0, agro-dollars industry to a $154 billion industry. It was transformed by R&D, Embrapa then, that's the Brazilian National Agricultural Research Program. They produce tropical soybeans and also other crops, improved varieties, and they also developed soil amendments that led to the transformation of that entire area. Just when they had gotten these technologies together, the new varieties and the soil amendments, the president now came in massively. And the government also built the rails and built the roads and built the access. So the two have to work together. And of course, the government also did land reforms, the policy on land reforms. We all have to recognize that the private sector is the driver, but the government actually creates the environment to enable the private sector to thrive. Otherwise, nobody wants to invest this money if it's difficult to actually make a profit because of very high expenses, high cost.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Ndidi, you want to respond to that? Interesting stuff.
I just wanted to build on what Dr. Martin was saying. I'm currently the coordinator for the visioning exercise, Vision 2050, Vision 2026, and Vision 2030 for the Nigerian agriculture, food security, and rural development intervention that the government is leading. And a lot of these issues have been forefront of what we've discussed over the last 3 months. But one we haven't discussed today is security. Security is so pivotal to the transformation of the agriculture sector. We had focus groups with agripreneurs all over the country, and they kept on telling us government has to get involved in addressing security challenges because we cannot source from farmers. We can't even manage our farms. And this cuts across the board. So I'd like to add it to the list of critical prerequisites for an enabling environment. security, 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 in addition to infrastructure. And then another gap that we continue to face is around food processing and value addition. I think this whole challenge in our sector, where we have 40 to 60% of our fruits and vegetables going to waste, 20 to 30% of our grains going to waste because we don't process. And we don't have food year round because we don't process. And I think we have to invest in innovation and technology around local processing, even the fabrication of the equipment to process. And I'll end with Martin's point on research and development. This has been a personal mantra of mine. We have over 30 research institutions focused on agriculture in Nigeria alone, 30. Across West Africa, there are 60. And yet, they are not market-driven. They're not demand-driven. They're not addressing the pressing needs of the private sector. And where they do have great research, it's not commercialized. Sahel is currently working on basics with cassava stems and Yiswa with yam seed systems. And we're seeing the opportunities that can be unlocked if you commercialize great research. And one of my key messages is that we need to transform all our research institutions. We need to streamline them. We need to make them demand-driven. And each of them should have a private sector advisory board so that every year as they're determining their research agenda, they actually have private sector informing it and they have clear matrix for measuring their impact. This is critical to enable us to leapfrog and to enable us to build back better.
Well, thank you very much, Ndidi. We're running out of time, but let me just take this question. Ndidi, this is still to you. Globally, Africa's top trading partners of agricultural products, including those in Europe, are also facing the financial strains from the lockdowns, which could curb demand for imports, turning them into less reliable trade partners for African countries. So in your own view, how do we hedge against the threats to both imports and exports? I mean, because Africa is now going to be like a less reliable trade partner especially for European countries. How do you think we can hedge against this risk and also strengthen trade of commodities across the continent?
I actually think that COVID-19 has been a mixed blessing because these disruptions in trade have made us look inwards to say what can we do within our continent. And the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is going to start in January, is a great opportunity for us to find trading partners within the continent. But we have to add value. I do not want us to continue to export cashew or sesame that's unprocessed. I mean, imagine that our cashew goes to India and then it's further processed in India, and then from India it goes to the United States. Why can't we add value? So I think for me, the challenge for us is how can we process more locally? That only increases our value and also increases our competitive advantage. The second thing is that we need to set clear standards within our countries and globally for what is good food, what is affordable food, what is nutritious food, and we need to ensure that we manage those standards to prioritize the needs of our people. It's for too long, Africa has been considered the sink of the world. There's so much dumping of substandard food on the continent. And yet, when we try to export, people say we're not meeting their standards. And I'm excited to hopefully see some changes in the WTO in a few days, right? Where we have an African at the helm pushing for equal standards and a level playing field for African produce, not only in Europe, but on the continent. And the third thing is that we need to raise the profile of African food. I've gone globally and I ask people, what's your favorite African dish? They don't know. They don't know anything about African food. African food is ranked the lowest in the world. Japanese food is ranked the highest. It didn't happen by chance. There was a concerted effort to raise the profile, to celebrate the food, to increase the knowledge of how nutritious our food is, and also to make sure we certify that food is actually originally from our continent. And I think we can work together across countries to uplift the profile of African food and to ensure that the rest of the world demands our processed food, celebrates our chefs, celebrates our great culture, and understands how rich and powerful our food really is.
Wow, interesting fact about African food and Japanese food. I never knew that. Okay, so we have a question from the audience, and I think this question will be to Dr. Martins. What is, from Ms. Oko, what is Africa doing about early warning signal, disaster management and mitigation? This will be for you. This is a question from Ms. Oko from the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Tosin. That's an excellent question. Early warning and disaster management is not just for cyclones and also for hurricanes. It's also for invasive pests like locusts. And one of the things that the FAO has done with the locust 19 invasion, one of the things the FAO has done is the development of surveillance. Surveillance, so you can immediately, detect when the locusts are coming, and then for all of the weather-related early warning systems, many countries already have in place, contracts with either some of the global satellites, major companies to be able to predict when the cyclone is coming and also move populations out. It is extremely important, but perhaps the most important early warning, more even than weather or more even than locusts, is farming. Early warning on farming, when there's a shortfall in food production, just because of drought or because of other, physical or biological events. And then the countries immediately are aware that there's going to be shortfall and start preparing for it. It's unacceptable for children and women and men to die because they just cannot get enough food. It's just unacceptable. I know the U.S. Food and Agriculture Department has started working with some African countries to put this in place, and they also have, even a farming warning system that actually looks at production of food in many countries, and then looks at demand, and then looks at shortfall. And also, I know that the G5 Sahel, that's the group of 5 Sahelan countries, are also putting in place something like that. But we need to, as an entire continent, to have an early farming warning system so that people can, know that there are going to be problems in marginal areas and provide food for those people. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Doctor. So our time is fast spent, so we need to just wrap up. But before we go, thanks panelists, and I'd like you to just briefly, in like 2 minutes, just state your hopes and projections for Africa's food systems, food ecosystem post COVID-19 pandemic, just in 2 minutes, starting from Professor Jerome.
Thank you. Sorry, I got caught out. Nice to be back finally after a lot of connections. I do think the rebuilding of economies after COVID-19 crisis offers a unique opportunity to transform our agriculture and food systems in general by making it more resilient to future shocks, like what we were hearing from our brother Fregene just now, providing healthy diets to feed the African population, which is going to double to 2.4 billion by 2050. The last parting shot from me is that the United Nations Secretary General is organizing a food systems summit next year. It's being anchored by Madam Dr. Kalebata of AGRA. She's the one organizing this conference. And it's an opportunity for us to buy into this food system summit. What sort of food systems do we need that will not break down again when you have another COVID? Thank you.
All right. Dr. Martins?
Let me give the floor to Ndidi. I don't feel like maybe the lady should take it, should come last. So
all right. Ndidi.
You're muted. You're muted.
You're muted, Ndidi.
Okay, I would say that this is a wake-up call for us. It's further reinforced the fragility of our food ecosystem and demonstrated how weak our food ecosystem is and how urgent it is for us to build back better. And critically, what are some 3 things we need to do? The first is that we need to stop thinking about food just as an agriculture issue. The food ecosystem affects the health sector, science and tech, finance, trade and investment, gender, climate change, and it's widespread. So it's critical that we start thinking about it as an ecosystem solution and bring unusual partners together to address this. The second is that we have to put private sector at the center. Private sector has to drive innovation and growth. And finally, we have to prioritize young people, engaging young people into the sector, empowering them, getting them excited about the possibilities in the sector, and unlocking the opportunities. And I'll say not just young people, I would put a plug for young women. We have to close the gender gap when it comes to agriculture and the food system. And young women, I think for us, are critical to addressing this. Africa needs to close the gender gap in agriculture, in the food ecosystem. It will unlock tremendous potential, but it will also empower us, not just for today, but for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ndidi.
Dr. Tosin,
quickly.
So just to build upon what Ndidi and Jerome said, how do we build back, in stronger and more resilient? I think first of all, we should think of this as a business. It's estimated that by 2030, the agribusiness sector in Africa will be $1 trillion. So the question is, how do we make sure that other people don't eat our lunch? How do we make sure that the Chinese and Vietnamese don't take away that business? We have to increase productivity. We have to get the seeds of the best possible variety to the hands of our farmers. We have to also improve marketing. Like Ndidi said, we have to build competitive value chains. Look at the whole ecosystem. So from production all the way to the consumers, we all have to come together to see how that's the private, public, the CSOs, the farmer groups will come together to say how do we build this strong value chain so that it's all about the market, so that somebody doesn't take away our $1 trillion market and then leave us unemployed. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. You can agree that, this has been very insightful, and thanks to everyone for joining. Hearing from the panelists, it's clear that agriculture will continue to be at the forefront of every African government, and we found out what we need to do, both from the private sector and from the aspect of the government, to curb food insecurity and to survive post-COVID-19. On behalf of everyone, I would like to thank the panelists, our distinguished panelists, for joining this session, and we hope that you would answer us when we call on to you in future. It has been an absolute pleasure moderating this session, and I would now hand over back to Moses, the MC, to continue. I wish everyone fruitful deliberations. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Over to you, Moses.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you very much, Tosin Adedoyin, Senior Manager, Tax and Regulatory Services, Deloitte. Also, I would want to say very big thank you to our speakers, Professor Jerome, Ndidi Okonkwo, Nwuneli, and Martin Fregene. Thank you so much for lending your knowledge to the African populace and beyond. A take home, we need to start treating agriculture as business. And when I mean business, we need to be more innovative and we need to secure that business, which is agriculture. And with that, we would forge ahead to the next future, because agriculture is one of the largest employers of labor